The sun streamed through the curtains, casting a golden glow over the pristine living room of the Harper household. Jessica Harper stood in the kitchen, her manicured fingers lightly drumming against the countertop as she stared out the window at the garden. 4 years, she dedicated herself to creating the perfect home for her husband, John, and their quiet suburban life. But lately, something had shifted. Jessica couldn't place her finger on it. John had been distracted, distant. His once loving gestures were now mechanical, and his late nights at work had become a regular occurrence. She tried to push her doubts aside, convincing herself that it was just a rough patch. That afternoon, Jessica returned early from her errands, her arms laden with shopping bags. As she walked through the front door, she heard muffled laughter from upstairs. Setting the bags down quietly, she climbed the stairs, her heart racing with a mix of curiosity and unease. The sound led her to the guest bedroom, where the door was slightly ajar. Peeking inside, she froze. John was there with Helen, their maid, a woman younger and vibrant, with her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. The two stood close, their hands intertwined, laughing softly as if sharing a private joke. Then, to Jessica's shock, John leaned in and kissed her. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. She felt her chest tighten with anger and betrayal, but instead of storming in, she turned and left quietly, her mind racing. Later that evening, Jessica decided to confront John in a composed manner. She found him in his study, reading over some documents. "John," she began, her voice steady but cold. "I came home early today." John glanced up, his brow furrowing slightly. "Oh, I didn't notice." "I saw you with Helen," Jessica said bluntly. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. John's face paled, but he quickly composed himself. "Jess, it's not what it looks like," he started, but she cut him off. "I don't want excuses, John," she said, her tone sharp. "I'm giving you one chance to fix this. End it. Now." John nodded, guilt etched across his face. "I'm sorry. It won't happen again." Jessica wanted to believe him, but a sinking feeling told her this wasn't over. A week passed, and Jessica tried to convince herself that things were back to normal. But one evening, as she walked into the garden, she spotted John and Helen by the pool. They were too close, their conversation too intimate. Then, just like before, she saw them kiss. This time, Jessica didn't hold back. She stormed toward them, her heels clicking against the stone path. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her voice trembling with rage. John stepped back, startled, while Helen looked down, avoiding Jessica's piercing gaze. "I warned you, John," Jessica said, her voice low and dangerous. "This is the second time. There won't be a third." Despite Jessica's warning, John and Helen found ways to continue their affair, meeting in secret at a nearby motel. The lies piled up, and Jessica's suspicions grew. One evening, when John claimed he was working late, Jessica decided to follow him. She trailed his car to the motel, where she saw him and Helen laughing as they entered the building. Jessica sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The betrayal was complete, and her heart burned with a mix of pain and fury. "This isn't over," she whispered to herself, her mind already plotting her next move. The morning after Jessica's discovery at the motel, the atmosphere in the Harper household was charged with tension. Jessica moved about the house calmly, her every action deliberate, but her mind was racing. She had given John a chance to stop, to redeem himself. Instead, he had chosen to betray her again. She wasn't about to let him or Helen get away with it. That evening, Jessica prepared a special dinner. She set the table with fine china, lit candles, and made John's favorite dishes. When John arrived home, tired from his supposed work, he was surprised by the effort Jessica had put into the evening. "This is unexpected," John said, eyeing her carefully. Jessica smiled, her lips barely curving. "I thought we could use a nice evening together. It's been a while, hasn't it?" John nodded, guilt flickering across his face. Jessica poured him a glass of wine and engaged him in casual conversation, subtly weaving in questions about his day and his whereabouts. He lied effortlessly, and Jessica felt her stomach turn. As the night wore on, Jessica's patience grew thin. "You know, John," she said, setting her glass down with a soft clink. "I've been thinking about us. About trust." John looked up, his expression unreadable. "Trust?" "Yes. It's the foundation of any marriage, don't you think?" Her eyes bore into his, daring him to falter. "Of course," he said, his voice steady. Jessica leaned back in her chair, a sly smile creeping onto her face. "Then why do I get the feeling you're lying to me? Again?" John froze, his fork hovering mid-air. The next day, Jessica decided it was time to take action. She began gathering information about John, Helen, and their clandestine meetings. Jessica hired a private investigator, someone discreet who could provide the evidence she needed. Within days, Jessica had everything: photos of John and Helen at the motel, receipts from their rendezvous, and even recorded conversations. The betrayal was laid bare in black and white. Jessica didn't cry this time. She didn't scream. Instead, she began planning her next move. The first step in her revenge was Helen. One afternoon, Jessica approached her while she was cleaning the living room. "Helen," Jessica said sweetly, making the young woman jump. "Yes, ma'am." Helen stammered, clearly uncomfortable. Jessica stepped closer, her smile icy. "I know everything. Every single thing." Helen's face drained of color. "But don't worry," Jessica continued. "I'm not firing you. No, I want you to stay. You see, Helen, I want you to watch what happens next. Because no one crosses me and gets away with it." Helen's eyes widened in fear, but Jessica simply turned and walked away, leaving her trembling in the middle of the room. That night, Jessica confronted John again. "John," she said, placing the folder of evidence on the dining table. "Let's talk." John opened the folder, his face growing pale as he flipped through the photos and documents. "Jess, I—" "Save it," Jessica snapped. "I gave you a chance, John. I warned you. But you couldn't help yourself, could you?" He was silent, his hands trembling as he closed the folder. "I've already spoken to my lawyer," Jessica said coolly. "You'll be hearing from them soon. And don't think for a second that this will be an amicable divorce. I'm taking everything." "Jessica, please," John began, but she cut him off with a glare that silenced him. "I'm not done yet," she said. "You and Helen thought you could humiliate me? Well, you're about to find out what happens when you cross a woman like me." Jessica Harper wasn't content with simply exposing John and Helen's affair. She wanted to dismantle their lives piece by piece, ensuring they felt the full weight of her wrath. Divorce papers were only the beginning. Jessica's strategy was slow, calculated, and merciless. The first target of her revenge was Helen. Jessica knew that the young maid didn't have much to fall back on. Helen relied on her paycheck to survive, and Jessica decided to make her life unbearable. Jessica began piling unreasonable demands onto Helen's workload. She left the house in disarray every morning, purposely creating messes for Helen to clean. She timed her requests poorly, calling Helen into rooms just to scold her for imaginary infractions. "Helen," Jessica said one afternoon, her voice sharp, "I noticed streaks on the mirrors in the guest bathroom. Do it again. And this time, try to care about your job." Helen, her hands trembling, nodded and hurried off to fix the non-existent streaks. Jessica watched her leave with a cold smile. But that was just the start. Jessica began subtly spreading rumors about Helen within the neighborhood. She let slip to a few trusted friends that Helen wasn't trustworthy, planting the seed of doubt in their minds. Soon, whispers began circulating, and Helen's reputation started to crumble. Meanwhile, Jessica was working on John from a different angle. She discreetly leaked the evidence of his affair to his closest colleagues. Jessica sent anonymous emails containing incriminating photos and details of his motel visits. The gossip spread like wildfire through John's office, and soon his once pristine professional image was tarnished. John came home one evening, his face drawn and pale. "Jessica," he said, his voice strained, Did you send something to my office?" Jessica looked up from her book, feigning innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about. My boss pulled me into his office today," John continued, pacing the room. "He had photos Photos of me and Helen. Now everyone knows. Jessica closed her book with a deliberate motion. Maybe you should have thought about that before you cheated on your wife, she said coldly. Actions have consequences, John. John's shoulders slumped, and he left the room without another word. Jessica's final move was the most devastating. She threw a lavish dinner party, inviting all of their friends, neighbors, and John's colleagues. She made sure Helen was present, too, insisting she help serve during the event. As the guests enjoyed their wine and hors d'oeuvres, Jessica stood to make a toast. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her tone warm. "I wanted to share some news with all of you. Something that has deeply impacted my family." The room fell silent, all eyes on Jessica. "John and I have decided to separate," she announced. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jessica held up her hand to quiet them. "And I'd like to share why. You see, my husband has been having an affair." She turned to Helen, her smile razor-sharp. "With our maid, Helen." Helen's face went white as murmurs erupted around the room. John stood abruptly, his face red with anger. "Jessica, stop this," he demanded. "Why should I?" Jessica shot back, her voice cutting through the noise. "You humiliated me, John. Now it's your turn." Helen fled the room in tears, and John followed her, leaving Jessica alone with the stunned guests. She took a sip of her wine, savoring her victory. As the party ended and the guests departed, Jessica stood on the porch, watching the tail lights of the last car disappear down the street. The cold January wind brushed against her face, but she didn't flinch. For the first time in weeks, she felt in control. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. John and Helen might try to fight back. And if they did, she'd be ready. Days after Jessica's explosive dinner party, the fallout was impossible to ignore. Whispers about John's affair and Helen's involvement spread throughout their social circle and beyond. Jessica had ensured they'd both become the subjects of ridicule, but she wasn't done yet. Helen hadn't returned to work since the night of the party. Jessica suspected she wouldn't. That suited her just fine. Helen's absence gave her time to focus on John. John, however, was spiraling. His professional life was in shambles. His boss, once a staunch supporter, now avoided him. His colleagues treated him with thinly veiled disdain. At home, Jessica was cold and distant, maintaining a veneer of civility only when necessary. One evening, as John sat in the study nursing a drink, Jessica entered the room. "You look stressed," she said, her tone dripping with mock concern. John didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the amber liquid swirling in his glass. "You should be," Jessica continued, leaning against the doorframe. "This is just the beginning, John. I warned you, didn't I? But you chose her over me. Over us." John finally looked up, his expression weary. "What do you want from me, Jessica?" "I said I was sorry. I begged you for another chance." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "What do I want?" "I want you to feel the humiliation I felt. The pain. The betrayal." "I already do," John snapped. "Everywhere I go, people look at me like I'm a joke. My career is ruined. Isn't that enough for you?" Jessica smiled faintly. "Not yet." Meanwhile, Helen was trying to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. Unable to find work due to the rumors Jessica had spread, she resorted to staying with a friend in a run-down apartment on the other side of town. One afternoon, John called her. "I need to see you," he said. "John, I can't," Helen replied, her voice trembling. "Jessica's destroyed everything. I have nothing left." "I know," John said, his voice filled with regret. "She's doing the same to me. But we can get through this together." Helen hesitated. Despite everything, she still cared for John. Against her better judgment, she agreed to meet him. The two met at a quiet cafe far from the prying eyes of their community. Helen looked worn, her usual vibrancy dulled by weeks of stress and fear. "We can't keep doing this," Helen said, her hands trembling as she clutched her coffee cup. "I know," John said. "But I can't just walk away from you." Before he could finish, the door to the cafe opened, and Helen's eyes widened in horror. Jessica stood in the doorway, her gaze locked on them. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Jessica said, her voice deceptively calm. She walked over to their table, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Helen shrank back, her face pale. "Jessica," John began, standing up, but she held up a hand to silence him. "Sit down," she said sharply. John obeyed, his face flushing with shame. Jessica looked between the two of them, her expression unreadable. Then she leaned in close, her voice low but firm. "I warned you both," she said. "And yet, here you are. Again." Helen opened her mouth to speak, but Jessica cut her off. "No more warnings," Jessica continued, her eyes burning with fury. "If I catch you two together again, I'll make sure neither of you have a life left to salvage. Do you understand me?" John nodded mutely, and Helen barely managed a whispered yes. Jessica straightened, smoothing her dress. "Good. Enjoy your coffee." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving the two of them in stunned silence. Back at home, Jessica poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the darkened living room. Her confrontation at the cafe had given her a momentary sense of satisfaction, but it wasn't enough. She wanted more. Jessica reached for her phone and called the private investigator she'd hired weeks ago. "I need you to dig deeper," she said. "I want every dirty secret, every skeleton in their closets. No stone unturned." As she hung up, Jessica leaned back in her chair, a cold smile playing on her lips. "If they think this is over, they're sorely mistaken," she murmured to herself. Jessica's carefully orchestrated revenge had left John and Helen battered and broken. Yet, despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake the feeling that her victory wasn't complete. She wanted to ensure they felt every ounce of pain they had caused her, emotionally, socially, and financially. Helen had hit rock bottom. With her reputation in tatters, she had been evicted from her apartment and was now living in a dingy motel on the outskirts of town. She had tried to cut ties with John, but he wouldn't let her go, insisting they could somehow rebuild their lives together. One night, Helen sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the flickering television in the corner. Her phone buzzed, and she hesitated before answering. "Helen, it's me," John's voice came through, filled with desperation. "I told you not to call me," she said, her voice flat. "Please, just hear me out," John begged. "We can't let Jessica win. She's destroying both of us." Helen let out a bitter laugh. "She already has, John. And you let her." "Don't give up," he said. "We need to fight back." Helen paused. Part of her wanted to hang up, but the anger and bitterness bubbling inside her couldn't be ignored. "What do you have in mind?" Meanwhile, Jessica was preparing for her final move. With the help of her private investigator, she had uncovered damning information about Helen's past, a brief stint in petty theft, falsified references, and even an affair with a previous employer. Jessica smirked as she reviewed the file. "This should do nicely," she murmured. She had already planted seeds of doubt within her social circle, but now she intended to go public. Jessica contacted a local gossip blogger, providing them with a file and a carefully crafted narrative that painted Helen as a manipulative, gold-digging homewrecker. By morning, the story had gone viral. Helen's face was plastered across blogs and social media, accompanied by headlines like "The Maid Who Destroyed a Family" and "Secrets of a Scandalous Seductress." Helen woke up to dozens of missed calls and messages. Her stomach churned as she scrolled through the posts, each one worse than the last. "She's ruining me," Helen whispered, tears streaming down her face. At the same time, John was fighting his own battle. His boss had called him into the office and terminated his employment. "We can't have someone like you representing our company," his boss had said coldly. John was spiraling, his life falling apart before his eyes. Jessica's revenge had been thorough and relentless, and he was running out of options. That evening, John and Helen met in secret. Both of them looked haggard, shadows of their former selves. "She's destroyed everything," John said, his voice hollow. "What do we do now?" Helen asked, her eyes filled with fear. John's jaw tightened. "We fight back." Jessica wasn't surprised when she received a legal notice from John's lawyer. He was contesting the divorce settlement, accusing her of emotional harassment and defamation. She laughed bitterly as she read through the document. "Desperate moves from a desperate man," she muttered. But she wasn't worried. Jessica had anticipated this and had already lined up her own legal team. The tension reached a boiling point when Jessica received an anonymous note slipped under her door. The note read, "You think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming. J&H." Jessica's smile faltered as she read the message. She knew they were angry, but this was a new level of defiance. "Let them try," she said aloud, though a flicker of doubt crept into her voice. Jessica sat in her dimly lit living room, staring at the anonymous note. She had expected John and Helen to lash out, but the tone of the message unsettled her. Her revenge had been thorough, but now she had to be prepared for whatever they planned next. Jessica picked up her phone and dialed her private investigator. "I want you to keep an eye on both of them," she said. "I don't trust them not to do something reckless." "Understood," the investigator replied. The next few days were tense but uneventful. Jessica continued her routine, carefully watching for any signs of retaliation. But the silence from John and Helen only made her more uneasy. Then, one evening, she received a call from the investigator. "Jessica," he said, his voice urgent, "you need to know something. John and Helen have been meeting with a reporter." Jessica's grip on the phone tightened. "A reporter?" "They're planning to go public with their own story. They're claiming you've been emotionally abusive and that you orchestrated a smear campaign against Helen. They want to paint you as the villain." Jessica's jaw clenched. "Let them try," she said coldly. The next morning, an article appeared online, "Scorned Wife or Calculated Destroyer. The Other Side of the Harper Scandal." It detailed John and Helen's version of events, portraying Jessica as a manipulative, vengeful woman who had gone too far. The article gained traction quickly, with readers divided in their opinions. Some sided with Jessica, applauding her for standing up to betrayal, while others criticized her for taking things too far. Jessica wasn't fazed. She had anticipated this and had been prepared for the possibility of public backlash. That evening, Jessica hosted another dinner party. This time, it was a more intimate affair, attended only by her closest friends and allies. "I know some of you may have seen the article," Jessica said, raising her glass. "Let me assure you, the truth always prevails. And the truth is that I've done nothing wrong but defend myself against betrayal." Her friends nodded in agreement, offering words of support. But as Jessica sipped her wine, her phone buzzed with a text message. "Meet me at the old pier. Midnight. Come alone. J." Jessica frowned, debating whether to go. After a moment, she made her decision. At midnight, Jessica arrived at the pier. The air was cold and damp, and the sound of waves lapping against the wooden posts filled the silence. John was waiting for her, his face partially obscured by shadows. "What do you want, John?" Jessica asked, her voice steady. "I want this to end," John said, stepping closer. "You've ruined my life, Jessica. Isn't that enough?" "You ruined it yourself," she shot back. "Don't forget who started this." John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I made mistakes. I know that. But this war between us, it's destroying both of us." Jessica stared at him, her expression unreadable. "What are you proposing?" "A truce," John said. "We both walk away. You get your divorce, your settlement, everything. Just stop." For a moment, Jessica considered his offer. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the weariness in his posture. He was a broken man. But then she thought of everything he had done, how he had betrayed her, lied to her, and humiliated her. "No," she said firmly. "You don't get to dictate the terms. I'll decide when this ends." John's face twisted with anger, but before he could respond, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. Helen emerged from the shadows, her eyes blazing with fury. "Enough!" Helen shouted. "Both of you! This has gone too far." Jessica turned to Helen, her expression icy. "You don't get a say in this, Helen. You're nothing more than collateral damage." Helen stepped closer, her hands clenched into fists. "You've destroyed my life, Jessica. I won't let you win. Jessica laughed bitterly. You already lost. The confrontation ended with the three of them walking away, no resolution in sight. Jessica returned home, exhausted but resolute. She knew the battle wasn't over, but she was prepared to fight until the very end. As she sat in her living room, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace, Jessica realized something. Revenge had consumed her, but she didn't regret it. She had been wronged, and she had taken her power back. And if John and Helen thought they could outmaneuver her, they were sorely mistaken. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.